2 Chronicles chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king of Judah, and he ruled 55 years from Jerusalem. Manasseh disobeyed the Lord by following the disgusting customs of the nations that the Lord had forced out of Israel. He rebuilt the local shrines that his father Hezekiah had torn down. He built altars for the god Baal and set up sacred poles for worshiping the goddess Asherah, and he faithfully worshipped the stars in the sky. In the temple, where only the Lord was supposed to be worshipped, Manasseh built altars for pagan gods and for the stars. He placed these altars in both courtyards of the temple and even set up a stone image of a foreign god. Manasseh practiced magic and witchcraft. He asked fortune tellers for advice and sacrificed his own sons in Hinnom Valley. He did many other sinful things and made the Lord very angry. Years ago, God had told David and Solomon,
Jerusalem is the place I prefer above all others in Israel. It belongs to me, and there in the temple I will be worshipped forever. If my people will faithfully obey all the laws and teaching I gave to my servant Moses, I will never again force them to leave the land I gave to their ancestors.
But the people of Judah and Jerusalem listened to Manasseh and did even more sinful things than the nations the Lord had wiped out. The Lord tried to warn Manasseh and the people about their sins, but they ignored the warning. So he let Assyrian army commanders invade Judah and capture Manasseh. They put a hook in his nose and tied him up in chains, and they took him to Babylon. While Manasseh was held captive there, he asked the Lord God to forgive him and to help him. The Lord listened to Manasseh's prayer and saw how sorry he was, and so he let him go back to Jerusalem and rule as king. Manasseh knew from then on that the Lord was God. Later, Manasseh rebuilt the eastern section of Jerusalem's outer wall and made it taller. This section went from Gihon Valley north to Fish Gate and around the part of the city called Mount Opha. He also assigned army officers to each of the fortified cities in Judah. Manasseh also removed the idols and the stone image of the foreign god from the temple, and he gathered the altars he had built near the temple and in other parts of Jerusalem. He threw all these things outside the city. Then he repaired the Lord's altar and offered sacrifices to thank him and sacrifices to ask his blessing. He gave orders that everyone in Judah must worship the Lord God of Israel. The people obeyed Manasseh, but they worshiped the Lord at their own shrines. Everything else Manasseh did while he was king, including his prayer to the Lord God and the warnings from his prophets, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Hosea wrote a lot about Manasseh, including his prayer and God's answer. But Hosea also recorded the evil things Manasseh did before turning back to God, as well as a list of places where Manasseh set up idols, and where he built local shrines and places to worship Asherah. Manasseh died and was buried near the palace, and his son Amon became king. Amon was 22 years old when he became king of Judah, and he ruled from Jerusalem for 2 years. Amon disobeyed the Lord, just as his father Manasseh had done, and he worshipped and offered sacrifices to the idols his father had made. Manasseh had turned back to the Lord, but Amon refused to do that. Instead, he sinned even more than his father. Some of Ammon's officials plotted against him and killed him in his palace. But the people of Judah killed the murderers of Ammon and made his son Josiah king. 2 Chronicles chapter 34. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king of Judah, and he ruled 31 years from Jerusalem. He followed the example of his ancestor David and always obeyed the Lord. When Josiah was only 16 years old, he began worshiping God just as his ancestor David had done. Then, 4 years later, he decided to destroy the local shrines in Judah and Jerusalem, as well as the sacred poles for worshiping the goddess Asherah and the idols of foreign gods. He watched as the altars for the worship of the god Baal were torn down, and as the nearby incense altars were smashed. The Asherah poles, the idols, and the stone images were also smashed, and the pieces were scattered over the graves of their worshippers. Josiah then had the bones of the pagan priests burned on the altars. And so Josiah got rid of the worship of foreign gods in Judah and Jerusalem. He did the same things in the towns and ruined villages in the territories of West Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as the border of Naphtali. Everywhere in the northern kingdom of Israel, Josiah tore down pagan altars and Asherah poles. He crushed idols to dust and smashed incense altars. Then Josiah went back to Jerusalem. In the 18th year of Josiah's rule in Judah, after he had gotten rid of all the sinful things from the land and from the Lord's temple, he sent 3 of his officials to repair the temple. They were Shaphan, son of Azaliah, Governor Maaseiah of Jerusalem, and Joah, son of Joahaz, who kept the government records. These 3 men went to Hilkiah the high priest. They gave him the money that the Levite guards had collected from the people of West Manasseh, Ephraim, and the rest of Israel, as well as those living in Judah, Benjamin, and Jerusalem. Then the money was turned over to the men who supervised the repairs to the temple. They used some of it to pay the workers, and they gave the rest of it to the carpenters and builders, who used it to buy the stone and wood they needed to repair the other buildings that Judah's kings had not taken care of. The workers were honest, and their supervisors were Jahath and Obadiah from the Levite clan of Merari, and Zechariah and Meshullam from the Levite clan of Kohath. Other Levites, who were all skilled musicians, were in charge of carrying supplies and supervising the workers. Other Levites were appointed to stand guard around the temple. While the money was being given to these supervisors, Hilkiah found the book that contained the laws that the Lord had given to Moses. Hilkiah handed the book to Shaphan the official and said,
"Look what I found here in the temple, the book of God's law."
Shaphan took the book to Josiah and reported,
"Your officials are doing everything you wanted. They've collected the money from the temple and have given it to the men supervising the repairs. But there's something else, Your Majesty. The priest Hilkiah gave me this book."
Then Shaphan read it aloud. When Josiah heard what was in the book of God's law, he tore his clothes in sorrow. At once he called together Hilkiah, Shaphan, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Abdon son of Micah, and his own servant Uzziah. He said,
"The Lord must be furious with me and everyone else in Israel and Judah, because our ancestors did not obey the laws written in this book. Go find out what the Lord wants us to do."
Hilkiah and the 4 other men left right away and went to talk with Huldah the prophet. Her husband was Shallum, who was in charge of the king's clothes. Huldah lived in the northern part of Jerusalem, and when they met in her home, she said,
"You were sent here by King Josiah, and this is what the Lord God of Israel says to him. Josiah, I am the Lord, and I intend to punish this country and everyone in it, just as this book says. The people of Judah and Israel have rejected me. They have offered sacrifices to foreign gods and have worshipped their own idols. I can't stand it any longer. I am furious. Josiah, listen to what I'm going to do. I noticed how sad you were when you heard that this country and its people would be completely wiped out. You even tore your clothes in sorrow, and I heard you cry. So, before I destroy this place, I will let you die in peace."
The men left and reported to Josiah what Huldah had said. King Josiah called together the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem. Then he went to the Lord's temple, together with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites. Finally, when everybody was there, he read aloud the book of God's law that had been found in the temple. After Josiah had finished reading, he stood in the place reserved for the king. He promised in the Lord's name to faithfully obey the Lord and to follow his laws and teachings that were written in the book. Then he asked the people of Jerusalem and Benjamin to make that same promise and to obey the God their ancestors had worshipped. Josiah destroyed all the idols in the territories of Israel, and he commanded everyone in Israel to worship only the Lord God. The people did not turn away from the Lord God of their ancestors for the rest of Josiah's rule as king. 2 Chronicles chapter 35. Josiah commanded that Passover be celebrated in Jerusalem to honor the Lord. So on the 14th day of the first month, the lambs were killed for the Passover celebration. On that day, Josiah made sure the priests knew what duties they were to do in the temple. He called together the Levites who served the Lord and who taught the people his laws, and he said,
"No longer will you have to carry the sacred chest from place to place. It will stay in the temple built by King Solomon, son of David, where you will serve the Lord and his people Israel. Get ready to do the work that David and Solomon assigned to you, according to your clans. Divide yourselves into groups, then arrange yourselves throughout the temple so that each family of worshipers will be able to get help from one of you. When the people bring you their Passover lamb, you must kill it and prepare it to be sacrificed to the Lord. Make sure the people celebrate according to the instructions that the Lord gave Moses, and don't do anything to make yourselves unclean and unacceptable."
Josiah donated 30,000 sheep and goats and 3,000 bulls from his own flocks and herds for the people to offer as sacrifices. Josiah's officials also voluntarily gave some of their animals to the people, the priests, and the Levites as sacrifices. Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, who were the officials in charge of the temple, gave the priests 2,600 sheep and lambs and 300 bulls to sacrifice during the Passover celebration. Conaniah, his two brothers Shemaiah and Nathanael, as well as Hashabiah, Jeiel, and Jozabad were leaders of the Levites, and they gave the other Levites 5,000 sheep and goats and 500 bulls to offer as sacrifices. When everything was ready to celebrate Passover, the priests and the Levites stood where Josiah had told them. Then the Levites killed and skinned the Passover lambs, and they handed some of the blood to the priests, who splattered it on the altar. The Levites set aside the parts of the animal that the worshippers needed for their sacrifices to please the Lord, just as the law of Moses required. They also did the same thing with the bulls. They sacrificed the Passover animals on the altar and boiled the meat for the other offerings in pots, kettles, and pans. Then they quickly handed the meat to the people so they could eat it. All day long, the priests were busy offering sacrifices and burning the animal's fat on the altar. And when everyone had finished, the Levites prepared Passover animals for themselves and for the priests. During the celebration, some of the Levites prepared Passover animals for the musicians and the guards, so that the Levite musicians would not have to leave their places, which had been assigned to them according to the instructions of David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun the king's prophet. Even the guards at the temple gates did not have to leave their posts. So on that day, Passover was celebrated to honor the Lord, and sacrifices were offered on the altar to him, just as Josiah had commanded. The worshippers then celebrated the festival of thin bread for the next 7 days. People from Jerusalem and from towns all over Judah and Israel were there. Passover had not been observed like this since the days of Samuel the prophet. In fact, this was the greatest Passover celebration in Israel's history. All these things happened in the 18th year of Josiah's rule in Judah. Sometime later, King Necho of Egypt led his army to the city of Carchemish on the Euphrates River. And Josiah led his troops north to meet the Egyptians in battle. Necho sent the following message to Josiah.
I'm not attacking you, King of Judah. We're not even at war. But God has told me to quickly attack my enemy. God is on my side, so if you try to stop me, he will punish you.
But Josiah ignored Necho's warning, even though it came from God. Instead, he disguised himself and marched into battle against Necho in the valley near Megiddo. During the battle, an Egyptian soldier shot Josiah with an arrow. Josiah told his servants,
"Get me out of here! I've been hit!"
They carried Josiah out of his chariot, then put him in the other chariot he had there, and took him back to Jerusalem, where he soon died. He was buried beside his ancestors, and everyone in Judah and Jerusalem mourned his death. Jeremiah the prophet wrote a funeral song in honor of Josiah, and since then, anyone in Judah who mourns the death of Josiah sings that song. It is included in the collection of funeral songs. Everything else Josiah did while he was king, including how he faithfully obeyed the Lord, is written in the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. 2 Chronicles, chapter 36. After the death of Josiah, the people of Judah crowned his son Jehoahaz their new king. He was 23 years old at the time, and he ruled only 3 months from Jerusalem. King Necho of Egypt captured Jehoahaz and forced Judah to pay almost 4 tons of silver and 75 pounds of gold as taxes. Then Necho appointed Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim king of Judah and changed his name to Jehoiakim. He led Jehoahaz away to Egypt as his prisoner. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he was appointed king, and he ruled 11 years from Jerusalem. Jehoiakim disobeyed the Lord his God by doing evil. During Jehoiakim's rule, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia invaded Judah. He arrested Jehoiakim and put him in chains, and he sent him to the capital city of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried off many of the valuable things in the Lord's temple, and he put them in his palace in Babylon. Everything else Jehoiakim did while he was king, including all the disgusting and evil things, is written in the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. His son Jehoiakim then became king. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king of Judah, and he ruled only 3 months and 10 days from Jerusalem. Jehoiakim also disobeyed the Lord by doing evil. In the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia had Jehoiakim arrested and taken to Babylon, along with more of the valuable items in the temple. Then Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah king of Judah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he was appointed king of Judah, and he ruled from Jerusalem for 11 years. He disobeyed the Lord his God and refused to change his ways, even after a warning from Jeremiah, the Lord's prophet. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia had forced Zedekiah to promise in God's name that he would be loyal. Zedekiah was stubborn and refused to turn back to the Lord God of Israel, so he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. The people of Judah and even the priests who were their leaders became more unfaithful. They followed the disgusting example of the nations around them and made the Lord's holy temple unfit for worship. But the Lord God felt sorry for his people, and instead of destroying the temple, he sent prophets who warned the people over and over about their sins. But the people only laughed and insulted these prophets. They ignored what the Lord God was trying to tell them, until he finally became so angry that nothing could stop him from punishing Judah and Jerusalem. The Lord sent King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia to attack Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar killed the young men who were in the temple, and he showed no mercy to anyone, whether man or woman, young or old. God let him kill everyone in the city. Nebuchadnezzar carried off everything that was left in the temple. He robbed the treasury and the personal storerooms of the king and his officials. He took everything back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's troops burned down the temple and destroyed every important building in the city. Then they broke down the city wall. The survivors were taken to Babylonia as prisoners, where they were slaves of the king and his sons until Persia became a powerful nation. Judah was an empty desert, and it stayed that way for 70 years to make up for all the years it was not allowed to rest. These things happened just as Jeremiah the Lord's prophet had said. In the first year that Cyrus was king of Persia, the Lord had Cyrus send a message to all parts of his kingdom. This happened just as Jeremiah the Lord's prophet had promised. The message said,
I am King Cyrus of Persia. The Lord God of heaven has made me the ruler of every nation on earth. He has also chosen me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. The Lord God will watch over any of his people who want to go back to Judah.